I'm going to start with some pretty ugly intro slides. A lot of today's presentation's adapted from a couple of talks I've been giving for years and iterating on, but these first two slides are like, let's just wedge some stuff right in the front. So, you know, setting low expectations for the slide design here. Basic background, I'm from St. Joseph, Missouri. I'm a Midwestern person. I grew up around no programmers to my knowledge, so basically self-taught in tech design. Been programming games since 1997, more or less continuously, about 4 or 5 games a year since then, although as I mentioned, mostly non-commercial. Released over 100 games, again, heavily non-commercial, so this is not like best-selling whatever, although I did have a top-selling iPhone game about 10 years ago, an Indicate finalist, technical game designer for Electronic Arts, an acquired Silicon Valley startup. I didn't acquire one, I worked for one that got acquired, and Somewhere Wellwright's R&D company. And then made about 200 nightly prototypes, 07 to 08. Not really talking about that much today, but if you dig up my background, that's also part of my bizarre semi-academic phase of life. I was in Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2011 for entertainment. I can ramble a bit about that. I think it's not as big of a deal as some people make out of it, but also, again, lots of asterisks there. So specific practical topics prior to the researchy chat. Perspective on independent development. Jeff was like, hey, you should mention that. So we can get that out of the way. Anymore, it's kind of like trying to make it like a writer or musician in terms of lots of people can do those things. You've got to find some way to really, really make your stuff stand out. It's not sufficient to be a great musician. It's how do I get people to pay me for my music or to develop a persona to be, you know, a marketable product person, etc. I'm a strong fan of keeping the day job until traction's proven in the market, until you've got millions of plays, until you've got sales, until you've got whatever. This can include in a lot of people's cases doing contract work or freelance work, which obviously if y'all are coming from an art skill set, lots of folks freelance in that kind of sphere. Basically letting someone else absorb the risk until, again, your kind of own IP is proven. And that the brain's a horrible emulator. So you've got to prototype and test stuff. That's going to be part of the points of the research I'm talking about today. Lots of folks think get too much in their heads about trying to plan deep into the future. And as soon as they start building something that's playable, it all just goes out the window and has to kind of start scratch anyway from lots of things we think are going to be fun aren't, and vice versa. In terms of self-management, everyone is drowning in distractions in 2018, which means if you can find some way to not do that, you just have a massive head start on everybody. Like everyone else around you, all the other businesses, all the other artists fiddling around on Reddit and social media all day. What I'm doing today, not necessarily like today, but like my work, training technical game designers at gamketo.com. It's a worldwide practice club. We've got people in like 16 different time zones building games together. I help answer questions as people get stuck. So everyone on those teams knows that like their games are going to finish on schedule. I do game dev podcast, YouTube, video courses. Had a former teacher I worked with classified as the millennial hustle of like trying to make sure I got presence on my personal brand and all that. But I am a living one of those, for better or worse. And I'm a speaker organizer. So I've been working with Indicate for 5 or 6 years, off and on. Worked with Indicate Europe, mostly here in Los Angeles. Did some speaking at Indicate EU. More recently, I've gotten involved with some other organizations arranging other speakers. But that's kind of the gist. I also connect a bunch of speakers and stuff. Actual subject today is arcade-style game design. Pinball's connections to digital game design. And I got my MS at Georgia Tech, where I did this research, which is where I met Jeffrey. Why this matters, like why I cared, what was my problem. At the time I was in industry, this is about 10 years ago, I was a technical game designer over in West LA at EA. They used to be 2 buildings, now it's shrunk into 1. And at the time I was kind of iffy about the whole research vector in terms of game at academia. I didn't really feel like that was the direction I wanted to go in my life, because when I looked at how games were studied, the different lenses and histories they talked about, it tended to come from one of 3 different directions. There were games as games of like decision and chance, board games, paper games, card games, these sort of games. Many types of games written about in that classification. Games that are narrative heavy, so anything from Zork to the story side of Heavy Rain or Myst, where like, yeah, there were puzzles and mechanics, but they were focused on, since the history of storytelling and plays and theater and cinematics, how we expressed ourselves that way in that medium. And then sort of like almost tangential to the video game space until fairly recently with esports, but the whole realm of sports play is an entire space of what people study about human performance and competition and training and this whole area of interest. But my problem was the kind of games I liked and grew up with didn't fit any of those traditions. Like nobody cared to talk about the story of Q*bert. Nobody cared to talk about the strategy of Joust. Like these games just weren't really about that. Like it wasn't like the physical dexterity is what limits you in Burger Time. And so that's part of why I didn't really have an interest in studying games, because they weren't going to talk about the kind of things I cared about. And there's several reasons about these, right? They're games of skill, but not really strategy unless you're like super top level. Like a world-class high score playing person in Pac-Man can discuss all kinds of strategy. The rest of us just try to go where the ghosts aren't, and we usually screw up because like, I made the bad call. The randomness is largely from sloppy timing. You're not rolling a die, it's because you're under time pressure and you meant to fire now, but you fired like now instead and you missed. And that's very different than like the sports dexterity, where in addition to the timing element, you've also got to like get your arms all moving right every time you're throwing a ball, delivering a punch, whatever it might be. These were rarely head-to-head contests, and there were exceptions, Pong pretty popularly. But for the most part, two players was either taking turns or shared goals. It was not really at each other in the same ways we tend to study in the sports traditions. And let's not mince words, the story was absolute garbage. Like, complete garbage. They actually ran out of cliches fairly quickly, and then just went to pure nonsense. And when I talked about like Bubble Bobble before this, it's dinosaurs capturing monsters in bubbles and popping them, they turn into fruit, and they eat the fruit, and then there's umbrellas that skip levels, and nothing made any sense. And here they're riding pterodactyl, or they're fighting pterodactyls, riding ostriches and buzzards, and it just, Q-Bert doesn't make any, none of this makes any sense. So why? And so I read a foreword of a book by Warren Robin, creator of Atari Adventure, and he made the point that a lot of the pioneers of our industry are getting older, and people should interview them more. And I was like, that's also true for Warren Robin, one of the pioneers of our industry. So I lived in the same area of the country, organized to sit and chat with him. And he said that if you're seeing things that don't seem as good as they can be in video game-related academia, that should look like an opportunity for you. And so I was like, oh, rather than feel like there's no way to discuss my games, I should go there and try to create that space to talk about these kind of games that I care about and see it as something like I can change. It's not just stuck that way. Now, this does not mean that those other histories or design frames are wrong or bad. This is part of realizing, kind of outgrowing my CS undergrad into a humanities grad field, to realize that in humanities, often there's many different correct ways to look at something. We'll just make different observations, it'll fit different parts of the medium, but it's not like oh, these other people are dumb or wrong, or we have to replace what they're doing. It's like we can add this to our tool set and see different parts of even the same games. So some categories from maybe the constructive side, they're all designed for high replay value. Obviously, they're in the arcade. It takes place mainly on one reused layout, and occasionally Donkey Kong had like maybe a 3 or 4 scene cycle. Extremely hard, immediately over in minutes. Again, you're paying with quarters. They want to kill you and get more quarters out of you. You play until you lose. There are, for many of the games, no official final win state. Now, you can get a kill screen in Pac-Man or something, but those weren't really part of the designed experience. You basically just kind of played until you lost, especially, again, if you're not like world-class record-setting Twin Galaxies disaster level. Playing to maximize score or prolong play, so your reward was mostly getting a high score from the same you're going to lose anyway, eventually, or your skill gets you more playtime per quarter. Reward skills with audiovisual spectacle. There's flashes going off, there's lights playing, there's sounds, there's all kinds of stuff. And there's fast-paced what Poland and Rain in their old pinball literature called the game of prediction, not reaction. So the steel ball in pinball moves about 4 meters a second in like a 3-meter space. Consequently, or far less than that, maybe a 1 meter, 2 meter space. So because of that, like you can't actually be waiting until something's happening to react to it. You're always trying to react before something even gives you the stimulus, which is just sort of a different kind of play than something like chess, where I kind of have as much time as I need to make a perfect decision, and that decision is going to carry out. And so, of course, obviously I've given it away, / was on the title, but pinball was sort of one of the maybe a better history for this that dates back further than the 80s. This actually starts back in kind of the 30s. And now the first connections kind of to that field, in the older pinball machines, where they didn't quite have the same sophisticated electronics or even decent electromechanical relay switch setups, you'd have one ball per play. And so it would literally have a hopper like a pinball gun, and each time you would spin a ball, it would fall into your balls played, and it was like your lives spent. And if we look at old Defender, old Pac-Man, old Joust, granted the metaphor is flipped, but you literally had extra ships, you had extra Pac-Mans, you had extra Joustians down the bottom. And they're like the little hopper of how many you had left. And there's an old interview from the Tilt documentary with George Gomez, pinball designers, being asked by a marketing guy, so I'm trying to understand what's going on here, like in the story or narrative. Am I the ball in pinball? Like, is that me? Like, do I die when I go down the drain? And the question doesn't make any sense, and that's part of what I like about it, because it's this nice kind of lens on immersion, where as much as now in modern cinematic games, we might actually try to think, like, how do we make the player feel like they're in World War II, feel like they're Lara Croft, feel like they're there. I never felt like I was Pac-Man at all. Like, I'm here, Pac-Man's there, oh, Pac-Man just died, I'm getting another Pac-Man up. It's just sort of a different sense of play than the immersion sort of mentality. And again, Pac-Mans. Now, speaking of Pac-Man, this is GB. It's actually the first published game by the person who later made Pac-Man as well as Pole Position. He actually was kind of obsessed with pinball games, but Namco Japan did not make pinball machines. So instead, this is a knockoff of Breakout with like pinball bumpers and other kind of pinball elements mixed into it. And the more you start to dig, the more you realize, like, also the voice of the Funhouse Clown, which is sort of this terrifying talking doll head in the pinball machine, was later actually the head of the studio that made Mortal Kombat and got involved with sort of that angle of the fighting game scene. Atari got its hands into pinball machine design early on. Superman, they were actually doing wide bodies, which turned out to be terrible for various reasons. But there wasn't a lot of experimentation. This is kind of its own curiosity of how the patterns and genres formed. And then lastly, what really sort of grabbed my attention was starting to hear these interviews with pinball designers and listen and read about their history, was they would talk about these things like near-miss design, where when you're playing these games, you're playing them in public spaces. It's not like you're home alone on your TV. It's not like you're at home alone on your computer, your laptop, on your phone personally. You're in a public space. Your friends might be standing there drinking a soda, judging you. And so when they would design the games so that no matter what you did at first, it kind of looked like, oh, I meant to do that. Like, I was shooting for that, but no one noticed because I'm basically firing into a crowd in Robotron or in Space Invaders or whatever, and asteroids. There's so many rocks everywhere that I'm doing something and I can kind of play it off like it's deliberate. That was often a key part of pinball machine design, where no matter what your angle of shot is, you can still feel reasonably confident that, like, you kind of gracefully flow with it, of like, oh, okay, well, I was meaning to do that, but I can run with this. And that near-miss design was like this interesting tidbit that didn't come from the board game study design group, that didn't come from the narrative design groups, that didn't come from the cinematics storytelling design groups. That, by the way, was Terminator 2's design. Obviously, as a technical game designer, my interest is sort of like this, but also like the aesthetics plays a pretty important role of like, this is part of what motivated me when I was looking in the market to buy and repair or flip pinball machines. That one grabbed my attention more so than like, this is kind of interesting, but like, that's really cool. So the actual research, was not a whole lot of it. This is part of why there maybe haven't been a lot of discussion of it. There was like 1 or 2 pinball research papers, or 1 or 2 papers that briefly mentioned pinball. And then like, this was kind of all the books. Like if we scrounge, there's probably 1 or 2 other books I have in storage, but like there wasn't a whole lot written. And virtually none of this is academic. This was all like collectors, restoration people, historian folks, people who lived it. It wasn't that long ago. My advisor for my PhD research, and as well as not technically my advisor for master's, but helpful during a lot of it, was Celia Pierce. And she studied online communities in the MMO kind of fashion by like integrating into them, by becoming a citizen of their world. Like a person in the real world might study a tribe by like living with them and fishing like they do and practicing like they do. And so I really like that kind of hands-on mentality, that kind of approach to research. So I spent an entire summer in and out of a pinball machine arcade, trying to get that. Part of what's nice about this place, this is actually up in Alameda by San Francisco, is they've got rooms of 50s, 60s designs, rooms of 70s, 80s designs, rooms of 90s and up designs. So you can actually see differences in the trends and the visuals, and the playfield ramp changed from 3.5 degrees to 7 degrees right around the mid 80s or kind of early 90s due to strength of solenoids increasing, all this kind of stuff I can just would love to go into. But also, so the Pinball Museum takes really good care of their machines. The reality is these are machines in public, which are just like a hellscape of broken pieces. The blackness you see all over this Elvis, that's iron filings that get picked up off the solenoid coils, dragged over by the ball. If it's not constantly cleaned and maintained, that's like irreparable, essentially. Anytime you play these, they actually at some point crossed the line where the electronics were good enough that if a certain piece is broken, at least the electronics can detect that and like change the game design on the fly to be like, there's never supposed to be pop bumpers there, or like, something else happens when you hit this thing because the whatever's broken. And there's this very weird adaptive space. It's like if you played Street Fighter and all of a sudden like punch didn't work, but the rest of the game did. And like nothing else was affected. And the machines tried to kind of work with that. Started doing pinball repair semi-professionally, like at bars, owned and flipped a couple machines. Because I really want to understand like, okay, what's going on inside these things and how can I relate that to my digital game space? And that included a really old and unfortunately, historically, culturally insensitive game, Big Indian, was one of them that I repaired. And it was actually really high rated in electromechanical field, had like a good variety of mechanics and stuff. But even though it looks so much simpler on the outside, including on its design, very straightforward kind of design. Again, you see the near-miss design where basically any angle is going to land you something looking vaguely intentional. The guts of it were a total nightmare because this is pre-electronics. This was electrical, not electronic. There's not a single circuit processor in any of this. These are all physical electromechanical relays that push and pull switches to connect complete electrical connections based on like ratcheting up a score on a thing or detecting when you've knocked down all 5 targets, or like there's a step motor in there that keeps rolling so that when you make points and there's like a real rolling and like ding, 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 it's literally just physically making all that stuff go, which is kind of mind-boggling of how that stuff's all happening. You actually see these chimes in the corner. I wrapped a black, thick dress sock around to dampen them because otherwise there's no way to mute the audio because it's like a doorbell chime, and I lived in an apartment at the time. Newer machines, this is Terminator 2, where very much chipsets, processors in the background, in the back glass often doing basically what the same underground switches all did in the inside of the old ones. This year it actually blown up and involved doing some, you can kind of already see there's actually black melted wire left of it. It popped when I wasn't in the lab where I kept the machine, and someone was like, I think your machine just died, and I found out and they were sort of right. I fixed it. So this is Pong, which one of the things people lose track of entirely because of how easy it is for someone like a modern day coder to smash out Pong in a bizarre 10-minute demonstration on YouTube, is that these weren't built in software. These aren't programmed. These were pure chipset games. This and Breakout were built out of chips. Part of the whole deal where Steve Jobs ripped off Wozniak at their brief window of time at Atari had to do with like getting Breakout to work with fewer physical chips. There wasn't like lines of code written. It was like the circuits would connect so that the paddle would go up and down when you turned the dial because of electricity and madness. But again, it's actually kind of closer to like what's going on here than some other stuff, and we'll go back to that. So in terms of pinball history, obviously nothing in the research world can start in like the 80s, so we like to look back further. This is some of the starts of pinball. Up top is people playing bowling in their lawns, noble people who had lawns, while the pedestrian peasants, yeah, either way, they would be playing essentially versions of billiards. And theoretically, this might be hearsay. I could not find a great source, but lots of things kind of anecdotally backed it up. The reason why pool tables are green potentially is to try to reflect the grass of the lawns that the noble people had when they could afford to have lawns, and the poor people in the bars had like these little table lawns. And down here we actually see an early version of bagatelle where it's target shooting. You can see there's little bells inside surrounded by nails or pins, and there's little targets to shoot it through, little pockets. This is an old actual comic from the era of Abraham Lincoln-ish, playing a version of early bagatelle with a pool cue. I don't understand at all the implications of this comic. I hope it doesn't offend anybody. This was a different time, all way over my head. Unfortunately, so JPEG, you can't tell what it says either. But on the left, we actually see starting the emergence of the casuals version of bagatelle. Had to do with making the game so it had more randomness to it. Instead of taking direct shots where you had to spend all day, evening after evening in the bars, which is a place that culturally dudes could just hang out at, other people who didn't have the chance to practice so much could use this really thick-headed mace, which is just a pool stick with a big old club on the end, to shove a ball up the right side ramp, and it falls down the pachinko pins into a pocket at the bottom. It's a pinball shooter thing. On the right, we have one of the early sort of patented versions of this, a little spring-loaded shooter. Shoot the ball up, roll down, and once again, it would land in those holes. Occasionally, there's an unmarked hole that would be like, extra ball! You get another shot with it. Might be a multiplier. If it hits the bell, might have some special effect. But wherever the ball ended up was kind of the endear term. There were obviously no flippers. Now, where that started getting pinballed and less bagatelled was early Depression era. So hopefully, as our economy continues to tank, we'll have new types of games emerge. Because what happened was, it used to be, in order to have, like, make money off games, and again, we're talking like 1930s, so games were, like, different commercially, you'd have to pay some person, technically minimum wage, probably not because it's a carnival, to sit in front of a game and, like, do all kinds of functions, right? They gotta, like, explain the rules, they gotta make sure no one cheats, they gotta hand you a prize if you win, they gotta, like, kind of make coax you, maybe encourage you, maybe taunt you, whatever it takes. Carnival barkers. They would sit there and they would administer the game, but you have to pay a human being somehow, or pay them a cut or something. But again, nobody had any money. So they can't even pay a carnival barker enough to pass along a price to a consumer. But if you put all this stuff into a machine, so the machine took the money, gave you the ball, made sure you didn't cheat, acknowledged your success somehow, then now we have a game where you can affordably buy it once at like $16 1930s money, which is like $250 US today, and then make it back 1 penny or 1 nickel or 1 dime at a time, because there was no overhead to each play. It was just machine facilitated, machine adjudicated rules. And you couldn't cheat. That's part of why there's glass. That's part of why we have a stool pigeon or a tilt sensor and other things, is it's trying to do what the carnival barker would do to make sure you didn't basically walk up and like poke the balloon or whatever you're supposed to not do in those kind of spaces. Now this is Ballyhoo. It's one of the earliest types that were commercially successful and mass produced. You'll see its design's quite abstract. We'll be going back to that in just a sec, but it's appealing. It's visually interesting. You walk over, you're like, ooh, what's this? It has a recognizable brand. Those brands got more complicated narratively. This is Dragonette. It's a blatant ripoff of Dragnet for anyone who's watched too much Nick at Night or is about my age group. In terms of like, it's a knockoff of this like detective scene, totally unlicensed, but trying to play off the TV media attention that was around the detective scene. Right around the time F-14 Tomcat was made by Williams, was like the year after Top Gun came out. This is not a coincidence. It's them trying to ride the wave of what Hollywood's doing with its money. And we still see a lot of the same thing happen today in terms of our commercial games, where there's something going on where for the next 8 years after Eraser came out with Arnold Schwarzenegger, every game had a railgun with a spiral helix around it, because like railguns were awesome, so Perfect Dark and Quake and whatever got them. Another part of these games, of the traditional part of the barker's role or of playing other types of games, board games and so on, was this really complex step of like knowing the rules. You had to learn the rules to play it. There's this whole cultural experience that comes from sitting there and having someone else walk you through things, correct you when you cheat, try to answer your questions, that like, that costs money to pay someone to do, so instead, it's a button. And if you're not supposed to use the button won't fire. And now the only rule you need to know is like, push the button, and if the button will let it go, then you're good. Like it's filtered so you can only do things that are legal. There's a whole second talk I might sneak in after this if I speed enough through the first one. But this was the innovation of flippers. They weren't around for the first maybe 2 decades. As 1948 with Humpty Dumpty. This one's the first one with flippers. Who sees them? You're probably looking in the wrong place. They're there. There's 6 of them. And they're backwards and they're along the sides. You'd push the buttons and they would kind of like this. They would just kind of like toss the ball back into the center to get a few more bounces before it eventually wound up at the bottom. But those were our first flippers. That was Humpty Dumpty. And there was lots of experimentation early on. So down here, you'll notice there's no gap in the flippers. That seems really easy. Instead, there's what are called gobble holes, where you would literally lose when the ball would land in the middle of the table, which is way more infuriating than the ball going down the center, at least for me playing with my modern sensibilities for games. But this is, again, like, early on, there was some experimentation. Pretty quickly, though, the format got standardized. Here's where you see one with a much wider gap, which, again, these flippers are also 2 inches instead of 3-inch models, so, like, they're nothing, and they're so weak. And, like I mentioned earlier, these were 3-degree tables, not 7-degree tables, 3.5. So the ball's actually much more floaty. It feels like you're playing in slow motion compared to a modern machine, but you hear it rolling on the wood. And it's kind of like baseball had this really satisfying crack of the wooden bat kind of vibe to it. The audioscape of these things was pretty phenomenal. Like, again, there are physical chimes in the room with you. The steel ball is kind of rolling along this polished wood. It's a whole thing. I sound way older than I am. Dexterity and input element. So in sports, they're great, but they're not for everybody. Like, there's a certain body type that if you don't have in certain sports, you're going to be at a massive disadvantage. You're going to get injured. You're not going to be able to reach the basket. You're not going to be able to run fast enough. Whatever it is, you're going to have to be extraordinarily out of the skate. Like, it's just not for everybody, right? But what's great about games, and this includes pinball or for like digital baseball, is I like to think of it as baseball minus t-ball. And it's the other part, right? Because in baseball, you have to swing the bat correctly and time it right. And t-ball, time is gone. You just have to swing it correctly. But in a video game or in a pinball flipper, the only element you have control over is pushing the button. You can't swing your arm wrong. This is part of why people who've never been in like a martial arts class can play Street Fighter. Every time you push kick, it does a flawless kick every single time. There's no element of like spending your entire life with a boxing coach to like punch better or to swing a bat better, which makes it much more accessible. Suddenly, you could have a much bigger market of players who can spend money on your game because they don't have to go through training, they don't have to go through regimens, they don't have to spend weeks of practice just to be able to participate in baseball. They can have no experience, walk up to the machine and play it, and it just does the thing correctly. In terms of the fidelity of the controls, so the bottom left we have an illustration from Steve Swink's book, Game Feel, which I'm in love with that book. He was on my thesis committee, and it has to do with the early mechanics of jump buttons and platformers. Still to this day, pretty common. The longer you hold the button, the higher the jump happens. Or another way to think of it is when you let go of the button, it actually kind of like cuts off your upward velocity, so you kind of fall down. So it makes it easier to platform jump, because you jump, so you're over the platform, you let go, and you kind of sink onto it. It feels very natural. It doesn't look nearly as janky as it sounds like it would. But this physically had an analog actually in old pinball, inadvertently, emergently. Some people get the wrong idea that there's like you're just pushing a wooden rod that's swinging a club. That is not what's happening. You're completing an electrical circuit. It's charging a solenoid coil, which is then yanking that metal rod into it, that armature, that flings the pedal at full strength. But because of physics, there's a time element to it, where if you just tap it, you're getting a shorter impulse. And so actually really high-skill pinball players can literally have the ball rolling down the in lane, flick it, and have it just sort of jump the ball across the middle lane. Because you can get a weaker hit from not a harder hit, but a faster tap. It's a time element rather than a force element. Again, in the same way as actually simulated force in all kinds of old digital input. I think starting with maybe Dr. Havoc or Major Havoc, where the longer you hold the button, the higher the jump would happen. In terms of rules metaphor, so this was Baffle Ball. This is another early contender for some of the first commercial pinball games. Where the ball would then, you'd shoot it out of the side, 5 balls for a penny. Again, talking about worse economy here. And it would land in one of these. Oh, obviously, it looks like baseball. Someone's like, I know what baseball is. I get the idea. Pretty cool. Now, notice, though, that first base is worth more points than third base. Right? Like, this doesn't metaphorically map. And that's because that's a harder position to hit with that flipper position. Like, the arc doesn't follow it as nicely. But it was more for just, like, this aesthetic draw-in to, like, this looks different than that other abstract one. I get it. This is a theme that speaks to me. Now, later on, machines got more sophisticated. In Playboy, of no affiliation to the other Playboy, you were actually trying to complete, like, hands of cards in, like, card kind of stuff, like pairs sort of thing. And what this allowed it to do is now you can have a game that played differently without having to explain the rules, because people knew the rules. So suddenly you've got a game that's different, that's more complicated, it's more interesting, it has more variety to it. It's different than last week's model, different than the competitors. And you don't have to teach a single thing because they already know, like, okay, well, there's certain ways you can do things with cards. In a nice version, this is one of the first games that had electrical bumpers. So before this point, the ball only scored when it landed somewhere. It would end up in a pocket and be worth something. It would hit a bell, and that'd be done. Here, it would hit these little pins, which they didn't actually kick back yet, but they detected you hit it. It lit the light along the top for 1 through 10, and you had 2 shots to hit as many of the pins as you wanted. It's bowling. You have this like metaphor. You don't have to explain it to somebody. They know how bowling works. You get 2 shots, hit as many pins as you can. That also allows, again, this added complexity for, unlike a pop bumper in some other game, if you hit number 1 twice, you don't get a second point for it. You already knocked over that pin. The light's already lit. And you get, again, this added layer of depth and complexity to the rules that I haven't to explain anything because you're leveraging outside knowledge. Here we have tic-tac-toe. Again, like this bizarre experimentation of like, what else can we do that differentiates our product? Again, obviously you can see weak, 2-inch, huge gap, terrible flippers. Make me sad. This is kind of like the penultimate blows my mind, works out of piano wire being pulled, and again, no electronics at all here. This was a Chicago World's Fair game. The ball actually leaps all the way around and then lands in these pockets, and then it turns these puzzle pieces. And you had to try to turn all the puzzle pieces to complete the jigsaw puzzle. And again, it works with like piano wire or something. There's no electrical stuff. But again, we get this interesting idea that like, okay, well, if I land it in the same pocket, I don't get added points for it. That piece is flipped. It's a jigsaw puzzle. I solved that piece. And we can kind of vary up our games. Now, when Pong came out, a lot of folks kind of forget, this was actually the peak of US popularity of tennis. People like paid attention to Olympic tennis, if that's a thing. People paid attention to national tennis. They knew the player names. It was actually kind of at the as popular as tennis ever got, in the same way as Mike Tyson made boxing popular, and Michael Jordan made basketball popular. You can tell I'm totally a sports guy. Andrew Agassi or somebody about this time period was like pretty hot. But obviously, otherwise, like it's not really tennis. Like there's lots of things about tennis, about the rules, about the scoring, about the whatever that aren't really what's going on. But it's a metaphor where I kind of get, okay, I got to get the ball past them and not past me to proceed. And what I like about this is it's this lens into games like NBA Jam or modern sports games to realize, like, this isn't basketball. Like, it's not striving to be basketball. It's striving to leverage your knowledge of the metaphor to have some idea of what are the actions I can likely take. What's my objective most likely? Okay, I probably get this ball into that hoop. There's only one of them. And then beyond that, it's like they can do whatever else they want with the game's design, with the tuning, with the pace, with the speed of it. And that's where a lot of our flexibility and fun comes from in arcade games, is realizing that we're really just leveraging that as a starting point so we can skip explaining rules to you and just kind of run with it and do other bizarre things with mechanics. Speaking of the rules in terms of narrative theme, so this is a early game. This was a sort of a time period where you'll notice on the board there's nothing narratively contextualized. It's 10 points, it's 50 points, it's specials, it's 7s, it's 9s, just numbers. Up here, this is actually the top of, I think, this is Humpty Dumpty. You can see the backwards flippers on it. Again, like there's no like put the pieces back together piece. There's no like, oh, I lit the thing that keeps them on the wall or brings in the horse medics or whatever. It's pure numbers and the Humpty Dumpty stuff, which is kind of a theme. Around the time of High Speed, which granted, this is actually after some of the early arcades, so at this point they're starting to kind of weave together in their histories, there was now a narrative element introduced by Steve Ritchie, same designer of the Terminator 2 game, in which, so there's these traffic lights, and each time you get the ball up through that ramp, it advances the lights from green to yellow to red, then you run the red light, then a siren goes off on top of the machine, and then the police are coming over on the PA to like, blah, 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 we're gonna get them, and you gotta keep doing the other stuff to try to like get the point, and there's like a narrative thing where you're running from the cops or something. In a way that before this, it was much more kind of like, and then there's 10 points, 20 points, whatever. Again, notwithstanding these like very sports or card game existing metaphors for rules. In the case of Breakout, does anybody know the story of Breakout before I show the pictures? Story of Breakout. It's pretty intense. Sometimes I bring my Atari manual to read out loud, but I did not plan ahead that well today. Guesses, even if you have no idea and are probably wrong. What is going on in Breakout? Yes, jailbreak. On the left side, we see a jail person in a jail outfit on the top and on the side, smashing the bricks to break out of jail or whatever. By the time a super breakout, now instead, the manual has a whole story about like this like rainbow force field in space where you're going light speed and you approach it and you have to like mesmerize and fight the colors to proceed back through space and whatever. The game had nothing to do with any of this. It was pure veneer. It was pure skin on top, like the pinball machines. Kind of like a Ninja Turtles blanket. It's like, here's a brand we can attach from the marketing side to make this kind of like, ooh, this is edgy now, or this is tapping into the public interest in space. Same time period as lots of other space stuff. But, you know, it wasn't that connected to our gameplay yet. And what I would love about this too is it reminds us, okay, why is Mario getting coins? The economy is clearly in trouble anyway. Bowser's in charge. He doesn't have like ransom on Peach. Or, you know, why is he winning money? What's the deal? Why? Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, literally, he's buying lives, which again has got this whole screwed up metaphor of like to get extra Marios or some nonsense. Okay, why is and like same thing happens even in modern games? Modern here, give me a hand wave. Lara Croft, which was modern in this version of it when I first did this presentation. Here, like people are being tortured and like the bad guys are gonna blow up the Earth and volcano or whatever the heck. But she's like wandering around finding GPS caches. Like she's just like, hold on, I gotta like collect the 12 to like get my extra achievement or whatever. And part of what's going on is really, I'm gonna go way back to these guys, like in this game that had this car narrative and the police chase and whatever, these bumpers aren't a metaphor. They're not like you're crashing the car. They're not anything. They're just points. And like rollover lanes were a common part of pinball machines to make sure you explored the whole board and you went all over the place. You used the whole space, which is exactly what Mario coins or Sonic rings or GPS caches are doing. They're giving the player a reason to go all over the place that's purely mechanical with no real narrative justification unless we're really hand-waving like she needs those caches because she's like real curious. And again, the other stuff's just kind of like, yeah, it'll sort itself out. Speaking of narrative, this is actually a point of contention between me and my actual graduate advisor, Ian Bogost. He wrote and contended that, like, in the case of Missile Command, you always lost to the Russians. Soviets, I suppose, at the time. Where, like, no matter what you did, you played until the Soviets won, and, like, there was this, like, narrative function of, like, you can't do anything to stop it. And my point is that the game's not supposed to actually end. Whenever you lose, you're supposed to keep playing again. It's like, that's not how it went. Let me do it again. Again, it's like, you know, in these sort of cases, there's like a black hole in the black hole pinball machine game. You're not like really sucked into the void and like, you lost, be sad. It's this thing that never ends. It's not the act of, it's not a play with a arc structure and a final conclusion. It is the act of fighting. It is the act of pushing against it in this repetitive looping fashion where each time you're doing it, you're still doing the key action, which is fending off those Soviets. Still. Cinematic prize. So early cutscenes. Back here we have, again, you can very easily see how low gradient these machines are on the degrees incline. There's little cars in the back glass here. Those are physical little toy cars on a track that when you do certain things on the board, they would race each other and like move ahead of each other and stuff. It was like little cutscenes. Or like these little boxers. Oh my god, it's so good. Like it would pull a little string and he would like do little punches and the other would like flip backwards onto his back and then the referee would like throw his arm up. And it was like when you'd get points, they would like punch each other. It was a little punching cutscene thing. And here we have Terminator 2, we've got Funhouse, Medieval Madness, blanking, Knockout, maybe? Punch-Out? Anyway, whatever it was. It's like a pub fighter, pub championship pub. There it is, something like that. Anyway, they started integrating these characters in there where you're like fighting them, you're attacking them. They're integrating them with the gameplay that you're literally shooting the ball into this dude's mouth while he's asleep. And like that's how you get like cool mode going in Funhouse, or you're fighting this Terminator and so on. In early arcade games, certainly the same. This is a cutscene from early Pac-Man, where between rounds you'd be fed this like little nonsense story sequence to be like, hey, you did some good gameplay. Let me show you a little cutesy animation. Da 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 da. And the same thing actually also happens in like early pre-Nintendo Tetris. The Atari arcade version has little Russians that come out and dance when you like win the round, because it's just like, okay, song and dance time because you did some stuff. And it was this mechanism where the story wasn't storying. The story is just like this reward cookie for like, let's show them a little puppet show or some stuff because the kid did good. I mean, obviously, kind of like this is still going on. Like, okay, granted, the story is more story now, but clearly part of what's going on mechanically is like story is still this kind of cutscene cookie. We're like, you solved the puzzles, you made some more progress. Let's give you another Witcher thing. Let's give them another few kind of talk lines where they get to know their characters better that they're getting invested in. And it's this kind of very different function for narrative than we have from a play, than we have from a book, where we're just kind of pushing through it. And instead, these are supposed to be rewards that have certain influences on the types of stories we might tell, or the types of scenes we might show. Arcade casual has sort of reemerged. If we kind of classify these vaguely as short play sessions, high replay value, immediate accessibility, very difficult, and minimum content length, we can start to contrast early arcade games to even early console games, where the console games, starting with maybe Atari Adventure, were longer play sessions, where there is story or explanation, where you'd win through just sheer persistence. Like, you don't have to be good at Zelda to beat Zelda, you just have to be really persistent, and you will eventually beat Zelda, as opposed to if you're not good at Donkey Kong, you will never make it to stage 2. Like, you just won't. You don't get to. That's not how the game's built. And so, like, when we start to look at these patterns again, so actually here are these doors where little Russians would come out and dance in early Tetris. Short play sessions for arcade, console games longer, short play sessions for arcade, console games longer, short play sessions longer. And what we start to see is actually in the casual space on mobile. There's been a reemergence of arcade aesthetic for kind of the same reason. While they're not constrained by RAM quite as severely, or processor capabilities quite as severely, the arcade gameplay sequence, part of what's good about it is you can pick it up, you can play it, you don't have to have an introduction to it, you don't have to have the rules explained to you very much. Every single time you drop right in, you play, it doesn't last long because you're standing in line to pee or something anyway, and you're done. You put it back on the shelf and you quit. Which is a totally different experience than console space, but has reemerged as this like incredibly relevant design space about 10 years ago, starting with Big Fish and all kind of explosion, into Indie XBLA, some of those sort of things, App Store, obviously. And I think it's no coincidence that essentially Peggle, one of the things that kicked off the entire casual games movement in the modern era, was basically Bagatelle. In terms of like, this is pinball, without the flippers, again, which is what preceded pinball. Part of what I like about some of the early indie games, like Cannibal, one of our early sort of infinite runners that popularized the genre, is again, much like the defending the US from the Soviets in Missile Command, Adam Saltzman actually explained in an interview about this game, like it's about this like moment from an action film where the character's like running across a rooftop and crashes through a window, but it's constantly just that moment. There's like not anything else to it. There's not like, why'd he jump through the window? It's like, shut up. It's like, what happened after? It's like, nobody cares. He's still doing it, and like that's what makes it so good. And again, like these other games, the whole appeal is like, you don't know nothing about this. You touch the screen anywhere and he jumps, and you're like, I get it now. I'm playing this because I can't screw this up. Because no one had to explain it to me. Because the rules aren't so complicated. I have to read a strategy guide to understand what's going on. I need to not fall and die or get hit by rockets and stuff. In terms of rapid prototyping, when I say things like the brain's a terrible emulator, this is partly a tradition from the pinball industry. What they do was whitewooding or other kind of terms for this, where they would literally, before they'd put in paint, literally paint themselves in a corner, because once you put paint on the table, you kind of like can't move that bumper anymore. They would leave it basically blank. Someone else would be thinking about concept art and other visuals, whatever, and just like drill holes, move stuff. Drill holes, move stuff. Because your brain is terrible no matter how much time you spend in CAD at predicting how it's going to feel, if the ball's going to stay flowing, if the ball's going to keep hitting that stupid thing on the corner. You can't tell until it's happening in front of you very, very, very fast. Because it's tied to our perception loops, it's tied to our muscle memory, it's tied to all these sort of little subtle things that our brains just can't do. This is part of why I do speed coding, is because oftentimes I'm coding not to build a thing that's worth building, but to figure out, is this worth coding correctly? And the answer, more often than not, is no. And so the faster I can get to that answer by putting it in front of myself and others and be like, is this any fun? Is this working? Is this okay? And the answer is usually no. Great. When I did my little binge on gameplay prototypes for 219 days between 07 and 08, 5 of those I turned into like real iOS applications, which like did pretty well in various areas of paying my rent in San Francisco or getting me an indicator or whatever. But most of them were total garbage. And I would never have found those 5 really bizarre things if I hadn't been able to do them and just put them in front of people like, how about this? Until somebody who was like a friend of mine who's on another indie was like, there's something here. This one, do something with this. And I'm like, okay, great. Because in my head, that seemed like garbage or a waste of time until I tried it and fiddled with it and experimented and just drilled holes, moved it around, drilled holes, moved it around. Gender issues. This is not with any pride. Obviously, game industry has complicated things going on in terms of a representation of gender, and for that matter, any kind of cultural thing we kind of lagged in. Pinball is certainly not doing us any favors in this regard. This was Humpty Dumpty, which for no explicable reasons has women in bikinis, which I do not remember at all from the story. Again, if we think about the narrative, like the actual market geographic context this sort of thing happened in, my advisor at the time, Celia Pierce, explained, again, men would wander into these bars alone with extra cash to spend at this era. That was just not a thing that people who were not men typically had the opportunity to do during this time period. But again, it plays into why this is sort of thing that happened for a lot of the early arcade games. CoverGirl was a game. More of that, I don't know. But anyway, pinball, no good at that either, including the people who got to work on the machines and all kinds of bad history from that. But again, in a way, like kind of builds a early history for where that happened in the digital game space, because a lot of them were the same people, the same companies, the same designers, and so on, carrying some of those same cultural traditions with them. In terms of payment and design, obviously these games were designed around putting a quarter into it, so again, they kill you real fast, they're hard, yada yada. People became acutely aware of this around the time of microtransactions and what felt like predatory, exploitative stuff, where it's like every time you do something, they're trying to hit you for nickels and dimes or quarters, essentially. Which, yeah, I mean, that's how the game gets paid for. And literally for a while, like, well, I say a while, it was like 1976, like pinball machines were illegal, like in New York City and Chicago and lots of other stuff. They were even illegal in Chicago while they were made in Chicago. And like they would walk into the factory and like ding a chime and turn off the lights because like the government's here, and they would pay them off because like that's what you did in Chicago. And then they would like resume manufacturing these illegal machines. But here there's like Mayor LaGuardia smashing pinball machines because these were illegal. And to be fair, they were also untrackable coin payments, which have been like really good for like money laundering or stuff, I guess. Speaking of which, some of these are literally gambling machines. So like these are bingo machines rather than pinball in the sense of they are far more luck-based. There's no flippers. It's just like a whole bunch of holes. You're trying to get like 5 in a row kind of bingo card stuff. This is a whole family of machines that actually were called payouts. You could literally earn money back. It's a physical slot machine. And this is also part of why those laws formed around like, hey, no pinball. until Roger Sharp, writer of a famous pinball book, actually like showed a city council, like, I mean, he called his shot, did the shot. They're like, okay, there's skill to it, and it was fine. But for a while, it's a problem. Learning to play, and we'll see if we can fit this in or not. It's a kind of a whole separate talk. There was instructions on these games that nobody ever read. Nobody cares. Nobody looks at this. Unless you've already played it so many times that you're kind of playing at a different level. When you're first playing a pinball game, or if I'm an arcade game, you're kind of playing to survive. You kind of like keep it in play. You kind of play to see, like it's like a putt-putt course. You got to poke things and see what they do. You're like, that one lit up. Did a thing. Yes, now Homer's talking to me or whatever. But you don't really care about the points until you're like past a kind of a level of, okay, now I'm kind of getting bored. How do I increase my multiplier? How do I get multi-ball intentionally instead of being surprised by it? But this is not something you'd look at before you play, unlike most other games. But so that's where I have a whole second little talk I could potentially sneak in if people are possibly interested. Otherwise, any questions about like pinball stuff? Pinball stuff? Yes! Stool pigeon. Okay, yeah, so stool pigeon, early tilt sensor. So a modern tilt sensor hangs a little weight inside of a circle, and if it bumps any side, it completes a circuit, and it tells them that you bumped the machine too hard. Speaking of which, nudging and tilting machines, as long as you don't activate the sensor, is fair play. People think it's cheating. It is not. It is absolutely not. Tournament level players do it. Pinball designers do it. Collectors do it. I do it. It's how you play pinball. It's a problem if you activate the sensor and it takes your ball away, and then the penalty is you took your ball away. But that sensor judges how much is it fair to nudge it, because before flippers, nudging's all you had. Stool pigeon was an early version of that, where it was, instead of having a little hanging bob, it was like a marble, I should have brought a pinball today, that sits up on a little metal, like little platform, and if it falls off the thing, it means you must have shoved the machine too hard. And so then when you try to like redeem your prize from like, oh, I got the little special one lit, give me my sandwich, which is the thing that actually happened, the bartender would look at it and be like, your marble fell off. I see you cheated, sir. And then you would like twirl his mustache or whatever they did. And then there was a little like thing he'd turn with his key, and it would like drop that down, let the marble pull back on top, and then it'd pop back up. But a stool pigeon was an early tilt bob to gauge. And also it actually, part of why they made the machines heavier and actually gave them legs was they originally were countertop machines. People would turn them upside down to get the stool pigeon back, and or to like get the ball over the thing and then like be like, oh, look, I did it. And so various mechanisms were designed around like stopping that from happening. Yeah. Any other questions about pinball stuff? I don't get to talk about pinball much anymore, so I'm obviously pretty excited. All right. Where was that pinball location? That one's in Almeda. It's just across the bay. It's by Oakland, in San Francisco area. It's like $15 for all you can play. Whenever you're up there, like it's just super awesome. And the people who run it are just the nicest people in the whole world, who like will just talk more about pinball than I can and just like keep going about stuff. So it's really nice. Yeah. And again, like the machines are immaculately well maintained. So there's none of that like real shenanigans of anytime you feel, including the Santa Monica Pier with like world famous arcade. People come from all around the world, and then they're like, oh, look, honey, pinball. And they see these 7 machines, and they're all in terrible condition. And it's just like heartbreaking, because like they find these and like the ball gets stuck and the machines are ugly and the flippers don't push with full force. Anyway, maintaining them is hard, and like part of, again, like I made money in Atlanta repairing them. Repair people are kind of a dying breed for pinball machines, because pinballs are kind of a dying breed. Yeah. Is there any like, would people be okay if I like also did like the other talk about like electro game rules? This was actually more of my interest, and like actually the whole reason I did my master's thesis on pinball was to have an excuse to justify this. Can we like have a waggle if you're okay with me doing this talk? Everyone's okay, good, it's okay, so people okay, okay, great. Okay, so as we said on the previous episode, as you might recall, we were talking about rules, and like that nobody cares or reads any of this stuff on pinball machines. Now when like we're playing Pandemic or some other kind of modern game, there's lots of rules to read, and it's kind of stressful. Where like you literally can cheat accidentally because you didn't notice that on page 4 in the yellow box, if you have like an even number of these things, then the certain thing applies and you can't play that card. Oh my God, I hate this. Like my brain doesn't do what that's supposed to do. And so that's part of why I like games where there's no rules. So let's try to distinguish what I'm talking about when I'm saying rules. And this is rules in the analog sense. So if we put tape on the floor, as shown here, just some painter's tape, and I time you, and I'm like, okay, you have 30 seconds to get from that spot to over here without crossing over the blue lines, and if you do, I'll give you my old Atari 2600 or something. And we can time you, and you can do it, and then there's rules there. There's rules like don't step over the tape. There's rules like if you take longer than 30 seconds on my stopwatch, you don't get the Atari, etc., etc. But there's like possible discrepancies, like did you step on the line? Like, was it like, did I stop it too late? Was it like 30.01, but like it should have counted? And we can argue over the rules because it's just like human enforced subjective. You could have accidentally skipped a line. You could have thought I wasn't paying attention and intentionally skipped a line. And this is like a real part of rules in physical sports all the time. It's why we have umpires, why we have referees, it's why we have slow motion. It's why people like get really angry about how their bets did or didn't pan out based on things that like objectively happened one way, but it was a subjective, kind of soft call of like, the foot was here, or the ball was there, or it was in their hand, or it wasn't in their hand. And it's really, really limiting to our rules when the only rules we can write for a game have to be those that human eyes can deduce reasonably consistently at a like human level of perception and attention and like remember. And suddenly we've got a much tighter constraint on the number of rules and the kinds of rules we can have. In Grasshopper, Games, Life, and Utopia, Bernard Sweets, one of my favorite theory books and game design stuff, talks about this kind of a notion of where part of what makes golf is that the rules prevent me from making the most efficient means to get that ball in the hole. I have to use this stupid steel thing to hit it and then like hit it from where it lands, and I can't just like pick it up and put it in the hole, despite the fact I can. That'd be way easier. But that if you could do that, it wouldn't be a game. And this is part of why he's like, and he kind of discusses like, is mountain climbing a game? Like these theoreticians do, they get these kind of like arguments themselves, like here's why it is or isn't based on the sort of lens of how it's useful to discuss these things. And it's okay, let's think about you're at the airport. You have to get from C18 to B16 or your flight takes off at 4. And it's like 3:35. And you know they close the door and will not let you on or they will like murder you or something in the United States if you don't get there in time. And so you're running through the airport. And this is very different from our tape on the ground game. You can't go through the walls by accident or intention. You can't go through the people by accident or intention. Like, if the plane leaves, it's not like, was the stopwatch right? It's like the plane's physically not here. You don't get to go on the plane because it's in the sky now. And it's this very different scenario of like, you don't have to have the rules explained to you of like, don't step over the blue tape. Did you step over the blue tape? It's like physically you're constrained, so the only things you can do are allowable, sort of, as we'll get to in a moment. Now, this is the case with chess, where like, we kind of internalize these things so much that we stop thinking about it, that like a piece from here to that piece, and now it's on that tile. But like you can do all kinds of nonsense here. You could like put a piece between 4 tiles and be like, what now, Kasparov? Right? You can just like slide things around multiple times. You can just like throw them. You can do all kinds of stuff that's like not chess. You can turn the board, do all kinds of things that aren't like legitimate. Now, is Pac-Man more like chess or more like the airport? Is it more like the tape on the ground or more like the airport? It's the airport. Like you can't push the joystick hard enough to go through that wall. You can't accidentally violate the game's physics and like fail to heed the rules about like, don't go through the wall or I won't count it and give you the prize. You can't. It is actually harder to get through that wall than it is to get through like airport drywall. Like if you're really determined, you can pound through drywall and make it through an airport wall. You cannot do that with Pac-Man unless you're like soldering and twin galaxying it. So if we're looking at like pinball machines on the inside, once again, these are electronically constrained machines. There is a flow of electricity. We might think of these things very abstractly as rules, of when I do this, that's the result that happens. But it's very, very physically cause and effect. It's drawing this thing open. It's pushing that thing down, and that's opening some gate somewhere, making something physically possible that before wasn't. It's not out of respect for the rules that I didn't get multi-ball yet. It's because I haven't worked this piece of puzzle into the right configuration where it then feeds me 2 extra balls. Again, if we look back at early pinball or early Pong, early breakout style games, these were built out of physical chipsets where again, it's much more materially obvious that like there's a flow of electricity. I didn't get the point because you ceded the point to me. I got the point because according to the electrical flow of things, that number went up. And there was no way either of us overlooked the legality of like, but was it close? Was the timer up? That's not how it worked. And I like actually these kind of folk games, like the Cell in Front of Cracker Barrel, with like the steel screws or like the horseshoes nonsense and the ring, where this is actually kind of closer to me, the rules of pinball or the rules of video games, in that you don't have to really know the rules. Like, obviously, don't use a blowtorch and just, like, destroy the piece to get the ring off. Like, obviously, come on, dude. But beyond that, you kind of just do what you can do with it, and the physical constraints are the rules. If you can't do it, you can't do it, because you can't. It's physical. And the ring's off, you won, because there's the ring and there's the thing. And at no point did someone have to explain to you, like, well, the following arrangements are illegal. Don't hold your hands like this, or we'll call you out. Then again, there's a whole technique to this. Spoilers for those who are missing out on this folk game, which I think is pretty well. So if we have like a little physical electrical box, and it's got switches, and it's got a little light, and our goal is to turn on that light, and I'm just kind of fiddling with the switches, flippy flip, 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 flip. Oh, I did it! I win! There's this kind of basic sense here of like, we could describe rules as, okay, well, when those two are up and that one's down, then I get the win condition. And we could have a human being administer those rules, etc. But we could also use electrical gates to do that. And so this is where, again, it's actually a physical result of when the certain electricity flows how it has to flow, we have reached our end state. Donkey Kong is now defeated. We finished off the aliens. We're going to the next stage, whatever it might be. This has a physical meaning inside the hardware where a certain physical state of current is going on that is not in a non-winning condition. This is extra obvious in really, really old Terrible Tiger handhelds where there were like so few positions on the screen. There was like, is your fighter here or your fighter there? Is like the kick here or is the kick there? And you could literally kind of see the state you're fighting through to kind of achieve the end results. A little less obvious in like a 3D rich world where stuff's going on. And this is actually a more modern machine where even though they took the switch relays are no longer at the bottom, this is either a high speed or a Terminator 2 I was working on. We still see, again, pure physical constraints. The player doesn't have to know, oh, this light's supposed to light up, oh, that drop down's supposed to go down or whatever, in order for that to just happen. Michael Liebe did some great research on writing about solitaire, that the game of solitaire on a computer is different from a physical game of solitaire because the game of solitaire is sort of a simulation of a universe in which the only things physically possible adhere to what would be the rules of solitaire. That like you literally can just mess with this and learn how to play solitaire. Because like if you can't do it, it won't let you. You just kind of, this is how I learned solitaire, I just kind of rubbed cards around. And you can't do that with a box of cards. Because you can do anything with cards. You can tear them in half, you can do whatever, throw them. Jesper Juhl wrote about soccer rules compared to non-soccer rules in Half Real. Talks about soccer rules with things like the playfield dimensions, the ball specifications, what players can and can't do, don't use your hands unless you're the goalie, don't kick other people, what are the win conditions. Not soccer rules, he contends, are things like air resistance, grass condition, human autonomy. Now, by his way of writing about it, he suggested like, you know, you think of it as like physical law, referee laws and physical laws. One difference between these two things, one a referee has to tell, the other the referee does not because they're just going to happen. You don't run 80 miles an hour in soccer because the rule is against it, you don't do it because your anatomy will not support it. In the case of making a soccer game, we kind of have to like start from creating the universe. And sort of the Carl Sagan case of making an apple pie, you have to begin by creating the whole universe. Okay, in order to have these rules work, Jesper Juhl's argument was partly that like we have to think of these air resistance, grass condition, human anatomy as rules. My argument was more from the other side of instead, these things that used to be referee laws become actual physical laws. That an NBA jam is a physical law that when the ball passes through the net, the score will be incremented. There's no referee judgment call to be failing it, to be misdoing it, to be cheating by accident, etc. In our airport scenario, I said you can kind of do anything if you physically can do it. There is an exception to this where they will tackle you if you do certain things you're not supposed to do. If you like swear at people and like commit acts of violence on people, if you're creating like yelling fire to get everyone to like jump on the ground or whatever, they'll get you, right? And that's because there are actual laws, like laws that are different from laws of physics. And so if we kind of have like a little grid here of do the players need to explicitly learn the rules and consciously obey them to avoid disallowed actions? For laws of nature, no. You just can't fly. You can't. Nice try. Computer game rules, you don't have to learn it. Because again, you just can't. But in the case of non-computer game rules or laws of society from police and legislators, you actually do have to kind of know the rule. All the time, there's like this ignorance of the law problem of like, did you know you weren't supposed to have the conversation that like had some sort of political difficulties? I don't know. Like, you're still accountable for it technically, but you could have done it because it's possible. That's why we had to have a law against it, because it was possible to do. Speaking of which, it's possible for the player to even violate the rule by accident or strategic intention. Not the case for laws of nature, not the case for computer rules, the case for board game rules or laws of society. Rule definition of rule violation must be at a pace and fidelity fully knowable and detectable by human perception and attention. This again comes down to this point of, in the game, we can have all kinds of bizarre rules about like, based on the distance calculation between the explosion source and the player, a different amount of percentage gets applied to their health based on their armor rating and whatever. There is no way it happens in a human educated rule game where in soccer we can be like, if you're a certain distance from the ball when this happens, then there's such and such a penalty on your statistical score because nobody can possibly keep that all straight. And then players of the game could enumerate their game's rules well enough for someone else to recreate it. This is the case where if you can play a card game, you can teach someone else to play the card game. In the case of computer games, all the time, just because you've played the game a lot doesn't mean you could write the code without actually going back and referencing what did the aliens actually do when they hit the bottom of the thing, and when and why did they speed up. It's doing lots of things you don't have to internalize in order to participate with it. This is an important distinction because in early platformers, part of what distinguished Mario from Sonic, they're both platformers that run to the right and jump on bad guys, some bad guys, has to do with these really subtle nuances of how the physics engine's coded, about how the jump behavior works, about how much air control you have, in a way that comes down to these nuances that are computer detectable rules at that pace in the microsecond level in terms of your inputs, that at a human educated level, jumping is jumping. If you're allowed to jump in a certain game, you can jump in volleyball. but they can't like change the laws of physics for your ability to yank yourself down from the air or to steer yourself in the air to differentiate one human real life sport from another. If you like this sort of thing, Game Feel by Steve Swink, again, book recommendation. Because part of what differentiated most classic early platformers from Mega Man, Ninja Gaiden, Codename Viper, Castlevania, really came down to how jump was different. Like, again, the rule in all of them is you could jump. But like, in some you couldn't move side to side, and some, okay, picture this. If you're jumping through the air and a projectile hits you, do you get knocked backwards? Do you keep going forward and you're temporarily invincible, or do you go straight down? Because different games handle it differently, and it made the platforming easier or more infuriating accordingly. I'm going to end on the note that all video games have the same rules, at least in the sense of rules that are like what we do with board games, aside from tournament meta rules. This is where like if it's like Smash Brothers and they're like, don't play Ness, don't play on this stage, don't use elbow smashes by Voldo, that's cheap. Then there's like a human meta rule. They can be like, you did the thing, you're disqualified. The rest of it is not. Use only standard input devices to interact with the values in RAM or saves. This has recently been contentious with some more Twin Galaxies nonsense. Twin Galaxies where there's special kinds of input buttons you can use that have a less of a delay time to the input than the actual arcade game input. And if they use that, it might be regarded as cheating versus like, or you know, for using a turbo button. Do not alter the hardware. Again, another common, your high score is disqualified in an arcade game kind of thing. If you've soldered the chips and like put a bridge between things that shouldn't be, you're not really playing the same game at that point. You've created a different flow of the electricity, something else is going on. The player credit is the person playing. Sounds obvious, but I thought may as well enumerate it because it's only like 5. But this is like someone can't take the SATs for you. Like that's not your score, that's theirs, right? So you can't submit your high score if someone else played it. That's a rule. If there's more than 2 players, you don't disrupt the other players out of the game. Games like Button creatively designed around this as being like the weird exception, like elbow your friends. But for the most part, if you like slap the other person, if you block their vision, if you like tickle them and mess with them, like that's not kind of the assumed behavior. And then lastly, the software must be used in its officially released condition, or if modded, then the same mods are known and installed by all players. You're not using view through wall hacks. You're not using mods that make people visible in the dark, other things that we did when we played Quick Team Fortress when I was like 12. Anyway, that's the thought of the game rules and digital versus non-digital stuff. My site's gamketo.com if you're curious to hear more of my stuff. But thank you. And yeah, fit it in. Hey. Any other questions about any of this stuff? Or just thoughts, comments, stuff you want to add? I can also talk about completely unrelated, just like indie game, life, career stuff. Yes, question in the back. Twin Galaxies. Okay, it's a high score group for arcade games that has had lots of contestations over the past 15 years or so. There's a great documentary, King of Kong Fistful of Quarters, that traces like a middle school science teacher or something's attempt to get the world high score in Donkey Kong, like practicing in his garage, and there's just this total just garbage human being, Billy Mitchell. It's a whole great documentary. But anyway, that has actually resurfaced now like another 10, 20 years later of there's new stuff disqualifying scores because there's little nuances about like, oh, you can actually tell because about a per frame slow motion viewing of it, the rendering display order on the screen reflects he's using a MAME emulator for capture rather than like official arcade hardware. Some of it also includes things that like, so there's some exceptions to these things. In early Galaga, it's like Space Invaders, but the aliens do these swirpy, swirl dive bombs. And occasionally they go off the side of the screen. And the enemy shots only scroll down if they're on the screen. And so if you get the first level and the bottom left or so alien, leave them alive, and like sit there for like 10 or 15 minutes suspiciously, like dodging if a shot occasionally comes your way, it'll build up all the shots buffer off the screen, and then thereafter no enemies can shoot until like the player dies. And so that's part of why they also have to review the footage, because like that's a kind of known obvious exploit. Like even if the game lets you do it, it's not okay. But yeah, again, human choices as to whether or not these things kind of count. Well, and even just playing games with our friends, even outside of the tournament realm, it just gets interesting as to obviously where we kind of human mitigate, or we kind of negotiate these rules as to like, is that cheap? Does anyone want to still play with that person because they keep doing this thing that, yeah, the game lets them do that, but like that's so stupid. Stop killing me through the wall. We know you can. That's like, stop it. But again, like opinions vary, and I'm partial to the idea like if the game lets me do it, it's fair. Granted, I'm not like trying to get awards for speed running or whatever. It's also as long as everyone's on the shared understanding, like that's how we're playing here. You know, I mean, I used to be a submission grappler, and there were like things that were like technically legal that like you don't do because you don't know the other person to do also. And so there's sort of this like kind of gentleman's operations of like, we're just not going to do certain things because we're just kind of here to practice or spar, have fun, or play GoldenEye or whatever it might be.
I wanted to ask about the nightly prototypes. What compelled you to do that?
My entire life had been nonstop making lots of little games And I just did whatever I wanted, and I thought that was super fun, and it was like my recreation and my outlet in life. Like some people love to dance, some people love to play basketball, some people like to draw. I just had to make games, and when I worked at Electronic Arts, like I kind of wasn't allowed to do that. Like I sort of was supposed to only work on company time, doing company stuff. And so I kind of went nutty while I was there, and was really annoyed at, like, I would go to an internship for a summer, and then come back, like, let me just blow up this video, and then playlists, background, and I'll just kind of play some videos. That's the 100 game summary. There's the experimental gameplay stuff. Boopity boop. Skip ahead, the backstory. Oh yeah, I could actually kind of do some tracing here. So shortly after I left, because I was just sort of losing my mind. So the story there was, again, like I would go there for a summer. They're working on Medal of Honor Airborne. I'd go back to school, make 4 or 5 games in our club. Go back to the next summer. They're still working on Medal of Honor Airborne. Go back to school for another 2 semesters, make another 4 or 5 games. There was like puzzles and action and space and whatever it felt like. Go back and they were finishing Medal of Honor Airborne. And I was like, if I had been here the whole time for like 3.5 years doing nothing but like obsessing over like where concrete bunkers are put in the hills for like, there's just like not what I wanted to do with my mind. I kind of I worked on Boom Blocks for a little bit, then just like bailed. But I went to, my brother was having like a get together in his backyard. And this friend of his was like, oh, you make games? Could you make me in a game? And I was like, okay, yeah. You bizarrely have no idea what you're asking, so this might be fun what you ask for. And I was hoping it'd be like this really off-the-wall, non-game designer thought, but it was like, okay, so it's Mario, but like my dog's in it. And there's like a rain level and an ice level and a fire level. When can it be done by? And I was like, 3 days. And so I just cranked out this just garbage game. You can see there's turtles. There was also kind of a little spin on it where the wind is inspired by Ninja Gaiden. I hope I get the mushroom at some point, because the mushroom's like using drugs mushroom, where, let's see, it might have already missed. You see, I blatantly copied some stuff, and that was kind of the idea as a fire level, whatever. There we go, mushroom time. And like you jump extra high, and you're invincible, and the dog becomes a giant bug, and whatever. And it was like this just nonsense of like game, and it says like winners don't do drugs, like classic arcade tip at the bottom. I'm a non-drug person. I'm vegan, very straight edge person, but I was in games, and it was all kinds of games of violence too. I don't do that in real life. So yeah, it was like this bizarre little 3-day thing. And then shortly after that, again, I was kind of like figuring out what to do with my life next. I went off to a startup where part of my condition of working with a startup was like I could just let me do whatever I wanted on the off hours because EA wouldn't let me. And I knew the startup founder, and he was super cool. So he was like, yeah, all right, let's basically just see how that goes. Now I'll just start showing him. And so every single night, I was using ActionScript 3, compile it command line. So it's compiled into Flash, but I didn't use the Flash tool. And 5 of them became iPhone games. That's Burn It, Feel For It was an Indicate finalist, Transcend was high ranking in education, Tumult played my written down to San Francisco for a year and a half. iZombie Death March got a publishing deal with Sonic Boom up in New York City. But for the most part, the rest of these are absolute garbage and no longer on the internet, like hidden outside of this video. There's including some that are like super embarrassing, super personal. It was every single night. So I would just be like making one that's kind of a diary entry about this like terrible date I went on, or like other just stuff, because it was throwaway. And when you're doing it nightly, there's like no investment in like, what if it's not good? So I'd also let people give me ideas. So my friend from Missouri was like, hey, I want a game where it's like really intense swinging. And I was like, all right, you got it. Let's do it. And so there's playing this like kind of like dun, 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 guitar music thing going on. And then when you start, there we go. It's just like off the wall. It's doing like heavy metal music and stuff. And it was just this very like one-off gag in a way that like you would not spend weeks to do this, but I spent hours to do it. So it was kind of fine because it was like, whatever, it's done. And it's kind of worked for a joke in a way of like, you play it once, you're kind of like, Chris, what's wrong with you? And you kind of go about your life again, and it's fine. And so that was one of the things I figured out is you could do this kind of one-off gags. So Candy, people complain my games are too hard. So this game, I made in response to that, where you click, and then you win, and it starts playing this like trumpet marching band song, and you did it, and you're so good now, feel pumped. Because it was like, why not? It's a one-off game where like I don't care because tomorrow I have to have another idea. So you know, whatever. And like starting, it's a killing spree. You have to kill them and eat them. Again, I'm vegan. And like part of what made this interesting to me was like they got bizarre after I ran out of ideas. Like everyone has this kind of stack of things in their notebooks at the back of their mind. Like, oh well, if I had made a game, it'd be like this. I ran out of those in like a week, and then they're just like off into the deep end, scratching the barrel so you're killing and eating the fish. Because again, you know, I don't eat fish. So I did some bizarre stuff here. It's called Contract, and it's a clue. You win this game by squishing the browser vertically to pinch the monster, which crushes it. because you could read this number. You could read this number in the code and be like, oh, it's less than 10, and you make a popping sound and you win the game. But like, there's no clue, there's no text, there's no information besides it's just called. Some people read like a contract. I don't get it. I say some people, like 5 human beings on Earth saw this at the time. Eventually, it got millions of views through Jaya's Games coverage. Oh, here, I think spoiler alert in case you missed this from literally a decade ago. Oh man, what's gonna happen? Nobody knows. So they give a response to it, so you're getting some feedback at least if you like. It occurs to you like, boom, you did it. So there's that. Oh yeah, so armistice key. Who knows what armistice refers to? When is the only time in your modern life you've heard the word armistice? Yeah, what's it for? Armistice Day, the end of World War I, the 11th hour, the 11th month, the 11th day. So you set your computer clock to that, and these turning dials are mapped to your computer clock. And so if you just put it to the 11, 11, 11, 11's all the way everywhere, basically, then you refresh. Bam! You completed the puzzle and you solved the lock puzzle because those, again, are values you can read in the machine. Lobster claws. So here, like, I hid the mouse and I drew a mouse. And then I like mess with you by like moving your mouse and you're not moving it and like not moving it correctly. So it goes backwards against what you're trying to do. And it becomes like little philosophy like, oh, you're not in control. It's like your claws are in a monster rubber. I was really tired and like, I was working at the startup at the time. So this is not all I was doing. This was like, I'd go home from working overtime and like do this until like 2 or 3 in the morning and like drive to work 3 hours later. So here you're clicking on these messages. It's actually kind of a loop we kind of like trapped in today of like, except it was MySpace because it was 10 years ago. And then like they would start to message you from each other and be like the email is sending you a Facebook message and then the blog is whatever. And eventually it throws poetry in your face. And it was trying to make this point that it's like interesting things aren't just going to throw themselves into your life if you're getting caught up in these stupid loops of like, stop doing this. Someone was really mad at me when they played this because they just sat in front of this expecting it would like send them a message. And I was like, oh no, you got to interact with it. I miserably dropped the ball. There it is. My favorite pumps. Yeah, so jokes worked. I could just keep talking about these if anybody's curious, like more random one-off prototypes. Insight puzzles, one-time use games. Tank, some of them were like straight up little gameplay things. Here you moused over things to shoot them. It was trying to play with some original mechanics, I say original like prototype ideas. You know, it wasn't just copied totally off something I'd seen before. Trying to try other ways to control and aim and steer. Here you're dodging procedurally placed anti-aircraft guns. It's obviously picking a random height and just throwing them at you. Again, these are kind of things I also used to like program on a graphing calculator. Same thing for a minefield, driving a jeep through it. You would see some common themes in some of these. Once I figured I could get away with it, I'd be like, aha, but this time it's a helicopter. And now you're surfing through clouds. Those were deterministically placed, so they're the same pattern of time. Here you shoot the thing to teleport to the thing, which is actually a mechanic we've seen in some indie games since. I deserve 0 credit for anybody stealing this from me, so much as like I just had this idea and then did nothing with it, so it's on me. But, you know, playing out. So this game was like you're trying to like time these ninja jumps. It's really hard, but you get scores based on how far your ninja jumps. Those things run at some sort of consistent interval, so it's really hard if you don't do it the first time, and it's kind of like get you to try to. So here, someone was like, I had this idea of what if you drew on a dead body, and I was like, okay. So I took a photo of my arm, and I give you a ballpoint pen, and it's trying to make you think like, do you draw differently based on your canvas and based on your instrument, and it scores your drawing based on essentially random. It's doing some sort of mathematical stuff in a way that like essentially a tiny difference would have done nothing. But it was just a bizarre idea from someone I met at a vegan meetup who was like, okay, you find a body in the street and you have a ballpoint pen and you tattoo it with your pen. And I was like, all right, I'm tired. I need ideas. Let's do that. So then that one is 20% quality rating. Again, it's more dead bodies need pen tattoos. Yeah, so there's one where you're talking to a squirrel, and if you say swear words, it screams at you. Someone just wanted to get me to talk to a squirrel. There's one where you like play as a little bugle who's like celebrating like a bugle won the dog competition for the first time. Here's a squirrel. And someone's like, I want you to be able to talk to a squirrel. So whatever you type, the squirrel just like, does a little squirrel sound. Unless you swear, then it gets really angry. But I was like, that seems to reasonably simulate talking to a squirrel. Another one's trying to distract you with like pictures up top that are like ferocious, intimidating, grotesque, surgical, semi-pornographic, classical art. Again, I'm kind of straight edge, showing using the actual pornography, but like paintings that had like adult things in them. That like you would see them, and you're trying to also like dodge these buses with a cow, and you have like no time. And so it's trying to be like eye-grabbing, attention-y stuff up here just to kind of play with your attention, distraction. Because a lot of old arcade games are like, you're focusing up here for the aliens and your ship's down here trying to do this other stuff. And the challenge was like, I got shot because my attention was needed up here when it should have been down there. And it's kind of whole thing of when you're making like throwaway prototypes, you could just take ideas from people because they're like, accept them and credit them because you're not investing weeks or months of your time or team's energy into it. Oh yeah, here's the one with the dog. And so here it's a procedural rhetoric. Ian Bogos wrote about like training people for Cold Stone Creamery, where like you'd have to like use the mouse to scoop the ice cream a certain way. And so here you're like using the dog to like, you're eating with lots of action and you potty by like sitting and pausing. and you sleep by holding stone, you play by jumping around. And it was trying to be like, oh, it's procedural rhetoric, but it's like being a dog. In this way they're like super garbage. So this one actually did really well. This one, oh no, this is Frost. This is garbage. So this is one that was the basis of the one that, I call these spacoids, where I just made these interactive particle systems with like just stupid mathematical correlations between distances to each other and distance to the mouse, and just play with them. And where I feel like that was successful was people who like games hated this stuff. They were like, this is stupid. What's the point? There's no goal. I can't win. You're dumb. I hate you. What's wrong with you, etc., etc. It's kind of, the internet. But my coworker at the time, who was a former Google employee, was like, these are the most interesting thing you've done. Like, these are really neat. And I felt successful because I had made this thing that people who didn't like games liked, and people who did like games didn't like. And so that's what I made this one of my first self-published iPhone games. Was called Burn It. Did reasonably well in terms of high rating. It was free, so I didn't make any money off of it. But that actually led the initial traffic to my InteractionArtist series that then got the millions of traffic to check out these things. This is Tumult. This was another kind of particle spacoid. This is where my programmer, my artist friend, was like, do something with this. That's the one that did very high ranking in entertainment apps in a way that, like, before entertainment apps on iPad, there kind of wasn't a category for this besides like screensaver. Like there was like games in stores, and we didn't like buy this off of the shelf. Here's another thing that's also just particle tricks. Try to look like a contact lens and play around with like generating particles and their bases off of images. My roommate at the time thought this was fascinating. It's supposed to be like a magic donut. More spacoids. These are kind of like make little alien sentinel tendrils. There's a whole series of these that are just kind of like, I don't know, like, again, like there's this thing, like the brain can't emulate this. I had some just bizarre mathematical thoughts I'd slap around and then do stuff with and be like, is this any good? And usually the answer was no, but the only way to find something the answer was yes, to just whitewood it, to keep drilling, moving the holes, moving the pieces, trying it again, seeing what it does. Also, the code for all this is completely illegible. This is part of like when you see like my speed coding on YouTube, it's habits that I formed during this time where I could just like, I literally every single night outside of working overtime at a studio would be cranking these out, which meant just like pure mismatch of like, okay, well, if I can type this fast enough, I don't have to remember anything of what's going on in here. Of like, okay, well, I'm just going to use 2-letter variables. Oh, this one I really liked. So the mouse up and down bends the shoulder and left and right bends the elbow. And you've got to like touch these bombs before the timers go down. This was actually the basis for Feel For It, my Indicate finalist, like in 2010, where instead you use the accelerometers on the phone to turn the joints, and the solution space was a certain orientation of your phone and like twisting and turning it. So like someone would be standing in a line like this with their phone, you'd be like, what are you playing? It's like, oh, that's Feel For It. But it was driven by this kind of idea of like, I like this sort of cognitive mapping of if you practice this enough, could you get really natural at like, boom, boom, boom. Yeah, here's Feel For It. I made a web version which does not work nearly as well. It just kind of tries to map your mouse X and Y to like polar coordinates. Oh, so this one I loved. So this one you can like tactily feel the surface by like stretch and distort the field. And when you move the mouse side to side, it moves the mouse as though it's tracing the curve. And so you could like generate 3D graphs of space-time or like Mount Everest's peaks and feel the top of them based on the visual feedback of how your mouse traces the curve. I don't know, here's the thing. I used the same thing I did for that lobster claws thing to like just hide the mouse and then draw a fake mouse where the mouse should be based on the topology or whatever. I think that one didn't go anywhere. So this was another experiment with like this like, oh, what if you practice this enough and like no one on earth ever did or would or should. But you have to like touch the red to the red one before they get you, or they like hide the thing. Some of these, I don't know if you know, it was Rob Hundel's marriage. It was trying to simulate his relationship to like his wife with strangers and whatever. Here it's supposed to be about like friends, and if you like don't get near them soon enough, then they fade away. And it's like super insulted a friend of mine from undergrad. No, this is the one. This is about exes. Yeah, this is the one. And again, like she takes your heart and tries to like run away with it. And you gotta like get it back or something. And then there's these other ones that try to like come and get you. And then they, oh, like my morale is down because she ran off. Or it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't really hold up. But it was just enough to like really make someone angry at me. But like I could fiddle with it because like again, like there was like, what if it doesn't matter? It doesn't matter because I spent like 2 hours on it. So this one was like another kind of like loneliness or something. Yeah, when you walk next to a certain dot, then they bind together and they orbit each other. This thing's trying to make some sort of point about efficiency of production and the market and the automation, or I don't know, whatever. I don't know, whatever. More of this kind of like flim-flammy metaphor, try to communicate a point. Eventually I got over this when I realized like this was a ton of work to struggle to make a point about voting that you could like make a sentence about instead. And like it just works so much better than trying to explain it through gameplay. If I was just like, I make the following observation about this system, and then I don't need to contrive a system. Oh, this one you're trying to like be the first one to break up with the other one. Bam, I got it. And again, like super, some former girlfriends did not like that. So here, this actually landed me my first paid contract gig. This drunk guy at the W at GDC was like, okay, so you got to barf and you're super drunk and you're going to get to the toilet. You're going to like, if you don't get to the toilet and you vomit, your friends have to clean it up. And I'd send it to him the next day and I was like, here you go. And when he was sober, he was like, oh, I got some friends at a solar panel company who need like an advertising game made. Can I put you in touch? I was like, yeah. So that was my first paying gig, was doing, because of that. Doing dishes, I love doing dishes. I was not allowed to do chores growing up, kind of overprotected. But because of that, like, I had this fascination in college of like, I could splurge on doing dishes. And so again, like procedural rhetoric here of like the edge of the sponge is really where the action happens. Like not the rubbing in the middle, but like the edge of the square is what makes the thing happen. And when you finish, it's just like, do you want more dishes? And you can click to be like, yes! And like, this is a photograph of my dish in my sink that I rotoscoped. Now, autobiographical interaction. So here, I was dating a girl over in Oakland when I lived in San Francisco. And I would be, again, still making these daily games, still working overtime at the startup, and like driving an hour and a half to see her or whatever up in North Walnut Creek or whatever several times a week. And so my nights were like this. It was the empty Civic Bridge, Bay Bridge, whatever it is over there, of just like the street lights. And I was like, oh, it's kind of this little moment, this little vignette of like there's no gameplay, there's no objective, but you can kind of steer side to side because there's no other cars on the street, because whatever. Also, I think it was a top and bottom deck, one of those kind of things. Oh, so here, another semi-autobiographical. I'm from Missouri. I'm the kite. Missouri here. This is my hometown park. Crook Park, a beautiful park. But it's trying to like fly me like a kite and I break free. Missouri tries to come back and get me. And I'm like, yo, I'm out of here. And like for the most part, my games are not artistically themed so much as they're just like, again, desperate for ideas, reaching, tired, just trying to get it over with. I'm typing Perl. So this is like a typing game. If you have like seizure, epilepsy, like look away, please. It flashes every time there's a letter. It has you typing some sort of archaeopteryx, or it has you repeating some really long word. Then it starts to like hide a message in it, where you're like typing a message and you don't know what the message is you're typing. And I was kind of curious, like, will you absorb what this word is as you're trying to start do some stuff? Communication action like game here is trying to show you stuff, but it's like, okay, is this good or bad? And you click on it if it's good, and you don't click if it's bad. And so I was like, okay, I can do this like from my perspective, from a Republican perspective, from a liberal perspective, from a vegan perspective. And so I would do ones that are like, okay, based on vegan preferences, and it'd be like gelatin. You're like, oh, I'm not sure. But it's trying to like get you thinking in terms of these very quick, short reactions you have based on someone else's religious affiliations, based on someone's political affiliations, whatever. And it's just kind of little reactive-y, physics-y, or psychological thing that, again, like no basis, no real research, goes nowhere. No one played this. Oh man, this was good. So this was the zombie one that tried to highlight like what makes games like Resident Evil work, according to me. And it's like, okay, well the shotgun does higher probability of damage up close, and you can only see a limited view frustrum, and they make sounds as they come into your sight, and they randomly rush at you, which makes it so you can't consistently evaluate their distances based on how they last appear to you. And if they get close to you, because you have a third-person camera, you can see them closing at the last minute. And I try to like illustrate that with like just like some dot products and little pixels and circles. The sound effects on this are also pretty legit. I might have recorded myself. I don't recall. But this actually became the foundation of iZombie Death March, a game published by Sonic Boom up in New York City, as part of my same deal as Alice in Bomberland, one of my favorite commercial games I made that no one else besides me likes, apparently. That was also from long ago. It's also the only game I ever ported to a non-smartphone handset, which don't make games for non-smartphones. Oh yeah, the Fleas game! So sometimes my games were about games, and I thought those were kind of fun. That's what the zombie thing was. So this Flea game, apparently as late as the Civil War, people ate like lice out of each other's hair. They would just like sit there and pick it out like gorillas do. And so the way this works is like you see there's little bugs in there as you kind of root around in the hair, and you're trying to get them. But the way it works is it's you, when you think there's no bugs left, you click you're done. And the only way to lose is to click you're done when there's still a bug. And so I actually, a little like maybe TMI, but at this point it's public information, I had like a little minor cancer scare like 10 years ago or something, maybe a little more than that, dozen or whatever. And like this kind of felt like how that surgical procedure was of like the doctor declares he's done when he's pretty sure he's got it all. And you really hope you didn't leave a little bit, because if you left a little bit, the fleas are coming back. And it was just this kind of different win state where it wasn't like, okay, James Bond kills the last spy, so the level's over. It was like, do I think my work here is done? Oh, and there's a little bit of wind gusting, so like the hairs kind of wiggle to make it harder to see if there's a bug in there. And it's like, I think I'm done. Probably, kind of poking around. Yeah, I got him. I ate the bugs. Good. Here, this was also sort of trying to be a little related to my little growth scare thing that happened to me, and again in a way that I didn't know. Oh, bees. I like this one. Here, it tries to make a point. If you have purely random AI, you just avoid it because they're stupid. If you have really deterministic AI, hold on, I'm avoiding them because they're so stupid. They're deterministic, also really easy to manipulate. This is like how you can circle strafe in old FPS games because they just chase you deterministically. You literally run circles around them. But if you make it half and half, now it's really hard. And this is closer to kind of how lots of other old games did their AI, where the mixture of random and determinism are like half the time doing one, half the time doing the other. You see this kind of teamwork effect of the deliberate ones keep you from sitting still, while the random ones kind of like seem like their teammates kind of coming around the other side or like covering the other background turf. And it was kind of just like kind of making a point about how AI worked in gameplay stuff. We did a whole thing about Pac-Man AI, just because again that was kind of supposed to be a point about. I didn't program that Pac-Man AI illustration, but that's another thing. Here you're just moving the mouse to like start a fire, and so it's reading the stuff. Perilous Row, I love this, and no one else cares. So here you're painting a painting of your gameplay, where like when you're in danger, the line is thicker. And so you're trying to like surf the wave, and you're creating a unique image that's like a record of your play. And if you made like a really thick, consistent line, you're like, that is a cool person. If you like draw a picture somehow, whoa, how'd they do that? But you can also see like when you're terrible, like, oh, I'm making beginner illustrations. And just kind of merged like a documentation artifact of your play. You can tell I was starting to gear myself towards like, maybe I'll apply to grad school and, you know, read about theory and stuff. Because it was my kind of my headspace at the time. And it was just kind of like, oh, this emergence of art and play and whatever. No one else has ever played or cared about this. Also, it's really hard to control. You have like an analog stick you control with a mouse at the bottom. That's part of the problem. So here, this is supposed to be a little poem thing where like there's a heart made out of gas, and when you move your mouse to the edges, the particles morph into becoming water. And it was kind of playing with like particle simulations, and I don't know. I thought this was neat. Again, like some people were like, no, it's dumb. I was just kind of interested in like particle effects. I kind of realized a lot of that game company's games, like Flower and what was not Flow. What's the other one? Cloud. Before that, yeah. So the old Cloud, basically, they were basically particle effects games. So I had an interest in like making particle effects. Oh, here, like you're a frog trying to climb falling sticks. Very frustrating. Very, very frustrating. Oh, so here, this is my faves. I have lots of faves. So here, you do a maze, and then the next level, like flips your mouse or whatever. And so like, I think you have like 2 where it does it normally. And then you get a level where like it rotates your mouse. So like mouse up and down is now side to side. And then mouse right is mouse left. And again, it had this kind of bizarre cognitive perception interest in like, I don't know, could you do this enough to practice at it? To the point that like, you just kind of get it.
Did you leave the thing on to be an indicator?
Oh, yeah. So the red dot's showing you when you're crossing a wall with your mouse, it's showing you where your mouse is going, so you can try to steer it back. But even that gets in Super Mirror, it's like rotated 90 degrees and flipped. And it's very frustrating to like make it around a corner and just very sort of headachy I had practiced it a lot.
So do you remember in your process if that was something you decided to do right away? Or?
Yeah, I mean, like basically it's because otherwise it was impossible to get the mouse back to the thing. Oh, so here I use the same version of that maze generation, but the walls get redder as you get closer to the destination. So you're trying to run through the maze that's randomly generated to get to the end point to make the walls as red as possible, and then you get the time. At each time it's randomly generating the maze, so you're like at the farthest possible point, because I was a CS kid, so that was like easy to generate. And so now like, okay, and I beat 15.3. And I got to run around this maze, and now the wall's getting redder or darker as I kind of walk to and fro and strafe a little this way and that way. And you're kind of feeling out your space. Oh, I had 5 in a row. At this point, I was running out of steam. They were the exact same game, but with a different name. It was also just particle nonsense. But I was like, if you call it banana, is it a different discussion than if it's called respect? This one's like some sort of like pongy, retro-y attempt at like you got to block all the balls, but it's kind of two-dimensional. It's like a horrendous, awful version of that. Same thing. Each time you click, it moves the center. But yeah, it's better. Again, at this point, I was like, I'm losing steam. I quit like 3 more days after this, and I was just like, I lost respect for myself. It still interests me though, like when the name is different, then like I don't know if it's an abstract name or if it's number 56, someone's gonna read into that and be like, oh, there's probably a clue in that, or I see it's about Abraham Lincoln after all, and whatever. I don't know. But like, you know, it's because otherwise it's all this abstract stuff. And so I had kind of interest in that. I would go sit at the museum and just like stare at stuff and feel inspired, and obviously be like so far from that world of things as to just coming home and copying and pasting my code and releasing it. I would actually make a separate project file. It wasn't like just the same Swift. That was something. Here you're a bird pooping on people. Another request somebody had. This is the Mike Tyson's Punch-Out background. This one you're playing a bow and arrow, shooting skulls. Some of these were just like pure little mechanical, arcadey experiment. Here you're trying to like shoot the puck in at a certain angle to make it ricochet the most times possible. And like the physics in this are bad enough it didn't matter. This is actually a bizarre sort of thing. You're trying to going through a tunnel like a wormhole. Turns out this one ran like garbage on Safari because of weird rendering differences. Dodgeball. Here you're running. I was trying to make dodgeball work with only a single click. And so you could like run to the ball and grab the ball and catch the ball with the same click or move yourself. So here I made a time version of Breakout where you can make time go to and fro. And so you could try to get the ball to chip away at the pieces. Here you're jumping back and forth across, I called it Hot Lava Monkey after the game we'd play in the ball pits as a child. but you're trying to not get the monsters to catch you as you jump from wall to wall. Sticks and stones can break your bones here. Words cannot. You know. Here, each time you bounce one off you, you get some more life in you, and you're doing, I don't know. Oh, so here you're like slashing things with a knife. It's supposed to be like iconoclastic, but obviously it had nothing to do with the modern game of that name. Final exam, here it's just like a narrative question, like, do you cheat? And there's a percentage chance you're going to get caught, and you just get like a dice roll. It was pretty lame. I did some morphing experiments with particles where I would read multiple ones. Some random generated path stuff where you could have to move your mouse on the platform with some sort of stuff. Here are the mouse up and down, aimed one, gun left, right, aimed the other. I think this is probably getting nearish to the end of those. Yeah, it was the end of it. Hey! And then there were some others that were like even worse or like super offensive that have now been scrubbed from the internet because like I occasionally work with children. Yeah, last school year I taught little children ages 4 to 10 every Thursday, and it was very different from working with adults, which is most of my teaching experience. This is also when I worked with middle school kids. I sort of embraced it. I have an energy level which is sometimes too much for adults. Any other questions or things I can also get out of your hair? I know this also worked great. Yes?
You said that you weren't allowed to work on things in your own time. Why?
So they've gotten better at that, partly because this was like early, like game jams were newish, like they existed, but they were nowhere near as huge as they were now. Indie game stuff was kind of newish around the same time. Again, this was like literally a year before even like XBLA, Steam blew up in Indie Sphere, casual games on Wii were like a year later, etc. So it just seemed like this non-thing of like, well, don't be working on games in your own time because it's going to be either A, exhausting or whatever, or B, like the company's going to own it. And there's this thing where like in lots of other states, if you work for General Electric and a lot of other states and like you invent a toaster, like General Electric owns a toaster because like they're paying you to be an engineer and they have rights to your whatever your outside stuff. California has a specific labor code. I'm going to get it wrong, but if you Google it, you'll find it's like 2870 or something, where if it's your own time, your own labor, your own equipment, no employees, no coworkers, never done on their premises, etc., it's like retained as yours. But I would like ask specific permission for their legal department. I'd be like, in this case, it was even like, okay, I wrote like my first little ebook before I dived into what I thought would be a career in AAA, and God, was I wrong, was I made a little PDF of like every game I'd ever made and like a page of lessons learned from like when I made my version of Qbert, here were my observations about it. And I did all that before I joined the company. And at the end I was like, and then I got a job, so I can't do this anymore, this public write-ups or whatever. And I was like, hey, can I release this PDF that I wrote about games before I came here, that I did about games before I came here, that I didn't do while here, that had nothing to do with anything here? And the executive producer on the project was like, sure. My producer was like, sure. And the legal department was like, no. Because it's just so much easier to say no than to look at the specific case of any given individual. And like, what was I going to do? Be like, I'll show you in court. They would just like, A, they probably wouldn't care, but B, if they did come down to it, I would just get crushed. And that was where I was like, no, I would actually way rather be making 75% less money, as I then did, to go work somewhere much smaller and just like make my own stuff on the side. Though again, companies have gotten a heck of a lot smarter about this because it pretty quickly changed and the landscape shifted such that if they were like, don't do game jams on your own time, all their talent would leave. So that's gotten better. But at the time, it was pretty just like, you can't. And to a degree, obviously not nowhere near the degree I was at or anything, but like even professional athletes have these things in their contracts of like they're not supposed to play basketball outside of their professional basketball playing because it's like additional risk of injury that is like millions of dollars on the line or something. Something or other. I don't know. Companies try to own your stuff. Gotta be on the lookout. Ish. Also, the nice thing about contract work is usually like they have no say over anything. The flip side, you get like no benefits. Any other questions? Yes. Just little reskins of stuff. Now, like to be fair, like again, like I obviously a pinball human being. Lots of pinball machines were pretty heavily reskins of one another, where they'd have to like change just enough to like get away with it. But they're basically like we're copying the layout of Tempest because it did really well in the market or whatever. Including once there were two flippers at the bottom of like one machine. Everyone actually even like sent kits to like modify their machines to stick two flippers at the bottom because otherwise they were like, you're not like the good game. And like everything was just that all of a sudden. And in the case of like actually part of it ate the pinball industry was a lot of the same electrical mechanical engineering skills could be applied to slot machines. And with far less design volatility, because then it's literally now there's fish on it. Now there's a king on it. Now there's pirates on it. But like, is the design worse? Who cares? It's literally the exact same game. Like there's market desire, interest in like, I feel more kind of aquatic. I'm more of a soccer person. I feel like, you know, my interest vector comes from Lord of the Rings type fantasy. And so like there's market meaning value to it. As a technical game designer, my interest in like, what do the boxes do? But you know, to players, like it was also admittedly like food for my imagination. So when I play on the trampoline, I'd like picture I'm a ninja now from Ninja Gaiden and that came out of the theme. So I don't know. In the same way as I got away with like 5 little micro prototypes of the same game with different names, reskinning's kind of meaningful. There's a place for it. Occasionally things might have taken off in the market that like the reskin did better than the unreskinned version because they just like flat out got the theme wrong and it doesn't resonate with the right target demographic of the game mechanics or whatever. So I don't know. I'm glad for and easily defending the very lazy, scammy reskins that they did, despite the fact reskins are a huge problem in like the map market. Oh yeah, well there were also these things you would buy back when I was a kid that'd be like 10,000 Windows games on a CD, and there was like a million versions of Solitaire, and they're all shareware, and it was not full versions of anything, and they're like Wolf 3D level 1 on or something. There were, but you kind of dig for it, yeah. But yeah, actually kind of a lot of fun because I would like play like 1 minute of the boxing game and 1 minute of the whatever game, and yeah. Unless there's any other questions, or I can get out of here. I know you got a work period, you want to do stuff. All right, thanks everybody. Hey.
Thank you.
Just finished speaking. Thanks for your support.